The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through Sterling's diner, like a gunshot, followed by a silence so thick you could choke on it. And in that moment, 20-3-year-old Emma Clark knew that her first day as a waitress was about to become either her worst nightmare or the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand, because the man standing before her, Richard Sterling, the millionaire owner whose cold blue eyes could freeze fire, had just watched his coffee spill across the marble table, and everyone in the restaurant held their breath, waiting for the humiliation that always came next. Richard Sterling had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small roadside diner into a chain of upscale establishments that bore his name, each one decorated with vintage elegance, black and white checkered floors, red leather booths, chrome fixtures that gleamed like mirrors, and chandeliers that cast warm golden light over patrons who paid premium prices for both the food and the atmosphere. But what most people didn't know was that Richard himself visited this original location every Tuesday and Friday, not to celebrate his success, but to feed something dark inside him, a bitterness that had grown like a cancer over the past 15 years. Ever since the day his wife Margaret died and left him alone with nothing but money and memories that cut like glass. The previous waitress, a sweet woman named Sarah, who had 3 children and worked double shifts to support them, had quit just last week after Richard berated her in front of a full dining room because his steak was slightly overcooked, reducing her to tears while wealthy patrons looked away in embarrassment. And she was just one in a long line of servers who had suffered his cruelty. He would find fault with everything: the temperature of his water, the fold of his napkin, the speed of service, the angle of the silverware, and he would deliver his criticisms with a coldness that stripped away dignity like acid, his voice never rising but somehow cutting deeper than screams ever could. And the restaurant manager, Tom, a kind man in his 60s, who had worked for Richard for 30 years, had begged him to stop, but Richard seemed beyond reach. Locked in a prison of his own bitterness, Emma had needed this job desperately. Her mother was sick, medical bills were piling up like autumn leaves, and she had dropped out of college in her final year to become a caretaker, watching scholarships and dreams dissolve, while she measured out medications and held her mother's hand through long, painful nights. But she refused to let hardship make her hard. She had learned from her mother that kindness was not weakness, but the strongest force in the universe. And as she stood there watching coffee drip onto Richard Sterling's expensive navy suit, she didn't see a monster, but a man. And something in her heart whispered that his cruelty was not his true nature, but a mask worn so long it had started to fuse with his skin. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade, each word precisely articulated, his blue eyes fixed on Emma with the intensity of a predator. "More than you'll make in 6 months, I'd wager. And certainly more than whatever pathetic excuse for an education you've managed to scrape together. Do you people even train anymore? Or do you simply hire anyone desperate enough to accept minimum wage and expect competence to magically appear?" The other diners looked away, some uncomfortable, others secretly enjoying the drama, like spectators at a gladiator match. And Tom started to move forward from behind the counter, his face creased with worry and shame. But Emma raised her hand slightly, stopping him. And she did something that no one expected. She pulled out a chair, sat down across from Richard Sterling, and looked directly into his eyes. "You can fire me if you want," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. "But first, I need to tell you something, Mr. Sterling, and I hope you'll listen, really listen. Not just hear words, but actually let them reach whatever part of you is still capable of feeling something other than anger." Richard's face flushed with incredulity. No one had ever dared to sit uninvited at his table. No one had ever spoken to him with such calm directness. And he opened his mouth to unleash a devastating response. But something in Emma's eyes, a combination of fearlessness and compassion, made him pause. And in that pause, 15 years of carefully constructed walls trembled just slightly. My mother is dying, Emma continued, and her voice cracked just a little, but she pushed forward. She has stage 4 cancer, and the doctors say she has maybe 3 months left. And every day I watch this woman who raised me alone, who worked 3 jobs to give me opportunities she never had. I watch her disappear piece by piece, and you know what makes me angriest? It's not the cancer, it's not the unfairness of it all. It's the moments when I catch myself being short with her, impatient, frustrated, because I'm tired and scared, and later I hate myself for wasting even 1 second of our remaining time together on negativity. Because, Mr. Sterling, time is the only thing we can't buy back, no matter how many millions we have. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds seemed muted, and Richard sat frozen, his hand still raised slightly from when he'd been gesturing at his ruined suit. But now that hand slowly lowered to the table, and something flickered across his face: recognition, pain, memory. This morning, before my shift, my mother told me something, Emma said, and tears were now sliding down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. She said that the measure of a person isn't found in their worst moments, but in whether they have the courage to face those moments and choose differently. She said that hurt people, but healed people heal people. And she made me promise that no matter what happens in my life, no matter how much pain I experience, I won't let it turn me into someone who spreads that pain to others. Richard's jaw tightened, muscles working beneath his skin, and his eyes had taken on a glassy quality, as if he were seeing something far away, some distant memory that he'd buried under years of bitterness and rage. And when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What was her name? Emma blinked, confused by the question. Whose name? My wife, Richard said, and now his voice cracked like breaking ice. You remind me of her, the way you speak, the way you look at people like you can see past all their defenses, straight to their soul. Her name was Margaret, and she died 15 years ago today, this exact day, May 15th, and she died because of me, because I was too busy building my empire to notice that she was sick. She had been telling me for months that she felt tired, that something wasn't right, but I dismissed it, told her she was fine, told her I didn't have time to go to doctors for every little complaint, and by the time I finally listened, really listened, the cancer had spread everywhere. And I held her hand in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and death. And her last words to me were, "Don't let this make you bitter. Richard, promise me you'll still be kind." And I promised her. I looked into her dying eyes, and I promised. And then I spent the next 15 years breaking that promise every single day. The confession hung in the air like smoke, and Emma could see the weight of it crushing down on this man, who everyone feared, this millionaire who had everything except the one thing that mattered. And she reached across the table, this young waitress in her simple black vest and white shirt reaching across spilled coffee to touch the hand of a man who had been unreachable for 15 years, and she said 5 words. Just 5 simple words that would change everything. She would have forgiven you. Richard Sterling broke. There was no other word for it. This man who had built walls so high and thick that nothing could penetrate them, who had turned his heart into stone and his words into weapons. He broke like a dam, finally surrendering to the pressure it could no longer hold, and tears streamed down his face, his shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and buried. 15 years of grief and guilt and self-hatred, pouring out in front of a restaurant full of strangers who sat, witness to the kind of raw human vulnerability that makes us all remember. We're more alike than different. Emma didn't let go of his hand. She held on like a lifeline, and she cried too, for her mother, for this broken man, for all the pain in the world that turns people into shadows of who they were meant to be. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the other people in the restaurant began to move. Tom came over and put his hand on Richard's shoulder. a gesture he'd wanted to make for years, but never dared. And Mrs. Chen, an elderly regular who had watched Richard's cruelty with silent disapproval for months, walked over and placed her napkin on the table. A simple gesture that somehow meant you're still human. You're still one of us. And one by one others joined. Not saying anything, just standing near, creating a circle of silent compassion around a man who had spent over a decade pushing everyone away. When Richard finally composed himself enough to speak, he looked at Emma with eyes that seemed younger somehow, as if crying had washed away years of accumulated bitterness, and he said, "I don't deserve forgiveness. Not from Margaret's memory, not from all the people I've hurt, not from you." But Emma shook her head gently and replied, "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, Mr. Sterling. It's about choosing to stop letting pain control our actions. It's about honoring the people we've lost by becoming who they believed we could be. And your wife, she saw something in you worth loving, worth making that final request to stay kind. So maybe the question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness, but whether you're brave enough to forgive yourself and start again." The words hit Richard like a revelation, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm that had lasted so long people forgot what brightness looked like. And he stood slowly, his expensive suit still stained with coffee, his face wet with tears, his carefully maintained image of cold superiority completely shattered. And he looked around at the circle of people, these customers and staff who he'd treated with varying degrees of dismissal and cruelty. And he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. I know those words aren't enough. I know I can't undo the pain I've caused. But I want to try. I want to be different. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left being the person fear made me, instead of the person love called me to be." Tom, who had worked for Richard through good years and bad, who had seen him transform from a hopeful young entrepreneur into a bitter tyrant, felt his own eyes burning with tears and said, "It's never too late, Richard. Margaret used to say that every moment is a chance to begin again, and I've been waiting 15 years to see a glimpse of the man she married, the man I used to call my friend." Over the following weeks, Sterling's diner underwent a transformation that had nothing to do with decor and everything to do with atmosphere. Richard began coming in not to criticize, but to listen. He learned the names of his staff, asked about their families, their dreams, their struggles. He personally apologized to Sarah and offered her job back with a raise and flexible hours for her children. He set up a fund to help employees with unexpected emergencies. And he started having coffee every morning with Tom, rebuilding a friendship that had been buried under years of pain-driven behavior. Emma's mother, Catherine, met Richard 3 weeks after the incident. He had insisted on visiting after Emma mentioned her mother wanted to thank the man who had given her daughter not just a job, but a purpose. And when Richard walked into their small apartment, with its worn furniture and walls covered in family photos, Catherine took one look at him and said, "You have kind eyes. They've been sad for a long time, but they're kind underneath." And Richard, this millionaire who commanded boardrooms and built business empires, sat beside a dying woman in her modest living room, and they talked about loss and love and the terrible ways grief can twist us into people we don't recognize. Catherine passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in July, with Emma holding one hand and her aunt holding the other. She went peacefully, without pain, surrounded by love, and at her funeral, Richard sat in the back row. But when it came time for people to share memories, he stood and walked to the front, and he told the gathered mourners about a young waitress who had the courage to see past his cruelty to his pain, who had extended grace when he deserved judgment, and how her mother's wisdom, shared secondhand through a daughter who embodied it, had saved him from dying while still breathing, had reminded him that it's never too late to choose kindness over bitterness, connection over isolation, love over fear. Emma used some of the money Richard had quietly given her, not as charity, but as a scholarship in Catherine's name, to return to college. She finished her degree in social work, driven by a desire to help others navigate grief and loss without letting it destroy them. And she continued working part-time at Sterling's Diner, not because she needed to financially, but because it had become more than a job. It had become a family, a community of people who had all witnessed the power of compassion to transform even the most hardened heart. Richard established the Margaret Sterling Foundation, dedicated to providing support for families dealing with terminal illness, ensuring that people had both the medical resources and emotional support to navigate the darkest times without losing themselves. He spoke at grief support groups, sharing his story with raw honesty, and he rebuilt relationships with his 2 adult children, who he'd pushed away after Margaret's death, asking their forgiveness and working daily to be the father they deserved, the father their mother had believed he could be. 5 years later, on a warm May evening, Emma stood in Sterling's Diner, now the director of the Margaret Sterling Foundation, and she watched Richard, who at 60 looked somehow younger than he had at 50, laugh with customers, ruffle the hair of Tom's grandson, who was visiting, and carefully wipe down a table with the attentiveness of someone who understood that no task is beneath us, and every interaction matters. And she thought about her mother's words, about hurt people, hurting people, and healed people, healing people. And she understood that healing is not a destination but a choice we make every day, sometimes every hour, to let love guide us instead of pain. That night, as Richard locked up the diner, he paused at the front door and looked back at the restaurant reflected in the glass, and he could almost see Margaret standing there, smiling, and he whispered, "I'm trying, my love. I'm finally keeping my promise. I'm being kind." And whether it was imagination or something more, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air, a sense of peace that comes when we finally align our actions with our values, when we stop running from our pain and start learning from it, when we understand that the worst thing that ever happened to us doesn't have to define us unless we let it. The moral of the story settled over Richard Sterling's life like a gentle rain after a drought. Bitterness is just grief that hasn't been given permission to heal. And sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to see our pain instead of our cruelty, to offer grace instead of judgment, to remind us with simple words that the people we've lost would want us to honor their memory, not by freezing in our grief, but by letting their love transform us into better versions of ourselves. Because the greatest tribute we can pay to those who loved us is to live in a way that proves their love made a difference, that it taught us something essential about kindness and forgiveness, and the incredible resilience of the human heart when it finally stops protecting itself and starts opening again.